Okay, so we are back again. Now we've seen the pre-audit research stage or the audit planning stage or the pre-contact procedures. Now we go to the fieldwork stage, and what goes into the fieldwork stage, what you are expected to know under the fieldwork stage of the tax audit. Okay, so under the fieldwork stage, we begin by looking at what goes into field work. What goes into field work? Okay, so the fieldwork stage of the tax audit actually involves a lot of things. So why? I told you that the fieldwork stage is the biggest area of your exam. So when it comes to fieldwork is a lot. So what are we expected to know under field work? What are we expected to know under field work? So field work or contact with the taxpayer, okay? Contact with the taxpayer begins with sending a notification to the taxpayer, okay? So notification is sent. So this notification that is sent to the taxpayer, you can look at it as an introductory letter, okay? And this introductory letter, we need to know what this introductory letter is, or the components, or the constituents, what it is. They can even ask you to write it, but now these kind of questions have not been seeing them. In the old kind of questions, yes, they tell students to draft an introductory letter. If it is a formal tax audit engagement, like where it has been outsourced to an audit firm, then they will send you an engagement letter, okay? They'll send you an engagement letter that they have to engage with you or perform an audit with you. So the engagement letter to you have to know the component. So this notification, then finally we arrange an entry conference, okay? An entry conference. And this entry conference is actually your initial interview. I think most questions always ask you the benefits of conducting an interview with a taxpayer or an initial interview or initial contact, okay? Initial contact and so on and so forth, okay? Now, this comes with looking at the taxpayer's rights, which can be covered under the legal framework, but there's something we call the taxpayer's charter. Okay, the taxpayer has to know his rights under the tax law. Okay, so they are contained in the taxpayer's charter, as well as the responsibilities of the tax auditor. So the taxpayer's charter talks about the rights, the responsibilities of the taxpayer, as well as the various things the taxpayer is supposed to do, the responsibility, the rights and obligations, as well as that of the tax auditor. Okay, so these things you have to just know about it. Then from there, you have to know the stages in this entry conference, because entry conference is the start of the meeting where you introduce yourselves. Then we have a tour of the business after your entry conference or your initial contact with the taxpayer. So you need to know the tour, you need to give a tour of the business, then review the internal controls. Okay, so review of controls. All these things is also to gain knowledge of the client. Okay, so review of the client internal controls, and internal control checking or internal control review is also very important. It also tells us how the client is complying with his own set rules. Okay, so the client has some particular activities he carries out. How does the client comply with his own rules that he has set, so that it may not lead to what inaccurate records or misinterpretation of the tax law? We talked about this in the earlier session. So after you have been able to do that, then we talk about gathering of evidence, which I told you that the gathering of evidence covers majority of your exam. So here, the gathering of evidence can become theoretical if mostly you are looking at evidence in general, and evidence in general, the most likely questions are sufficiency and appropriateness of audit evidence. Sufficiency and appropriateness of audit evidence. That's the first part. Then you have to look at the techniques for gathering evidence. Okay. So I usually use Recarium. How do we gather evidence? The techniques for gathering evidence. It could be re-performance, inquiry, calculation, confirmation, analytical procedure, recalculation, inspection, and observation. Okay. Then you also have to look at the objectives or the reasons why you conduct these tests, which we call the financial statement assertions. So there may be assertions relating to transactions or profit and loss items. There may be assertions relating to account balances, that's balance sheet items. Okay. Then there are assertions relating to presentation and disclosure. Okay, which are the notes to the accounts. Okay, so all these things you have to know them, and these are the key areas that mostly you are going to be asked theory questions. Okay, but they can also come practically where you have to compile audit procedures. Okay, where you have to do audit procedures, and audit procedures, I told you, they constitute 60% of your exam. Almost all the time, you have to do procedures, whether you like it or not. You have to do procedures, and every good procedure has three components or three features. Every good audit procedure has three features. One, every procedure must have an action or simply a verb. What are you going to do? Okay, so how? This asks the question how you want to do the audit. So how? Ask management, okay? Ask inquiry, inspect action. Not so. So after the action, the next feature of every audit procedure after action is the action you are doing on what? What are you performing the action on? So every audit procedure has an action and a source, okay, which is the source of the information or the document or something you are going to what? To check. So this one is where this recario thing I was talking about comes in: the recalculation, reperformance, inquiry, confirmation, analytical procedure, and inspection are found. Then the source is mostly a noun also, and this source is actually asking the question, what am I working on? What am I testing? So I'm saying inspect what? An asset, maybe a van. Inspect a van. Okay, so this van becomes the source. I'm inspecting the van. Then finally, the third one is what? So this asks how, this asks what. Then the third one is a reason, okay, or the purpose why you are asking about the van or you are inspecting the van, right? The purpose. Why? It asks the question, why am I testing, right? The purpose or the reason why you are carrying out the test or the objective of the testing. So inspect what? A van. Why? To confirm existence, right? So to confirm existence of that van, okay? So this one goes with the assertions, okay? So every good procedure actually has an action, a source, and a purpose, ASP. How do you want to carry out the test? On what do you want to carry the test? And why do you want to carry out the audit test? So this is very important for every exam. And then these audit procedures that you are going to do, most of the time, you can get a question for 5 marks. And for 5 marks means that you get 1 mark per procedure, okay? 1 mark per procedure. Very, very important. 1 mark per procedure. So this one, you have to be very careful. You have to look at it very well. So there's a general program which actually mostly works for audits, almost all audits. So there's a general audit program or strategy that you can use, okay, which will mostly work for most audits. And then I would also look at it as we go through. But then these are just some key features of all procedures. And audit procedures can come for financial statement items, okay? And it can also come for tax types. Okay, so it can also come for tax types. So tax types, the common tax types that you can have audit procedures on is mostly VAT and customs, okay? But apart from that, you can also get capital gains, and then maybe some income tax, some particular income tax. But the common ones that you can get under income tax is withholding tax, okay? Where you have to do an audit procedure on withholding tax. But for financial statement items, the common things you are mostly going to get is gross income or gross receipt, which is revenue, and then your purchases, labor cost, especially payroll. Payroll, very important. So when you look at the areas of tax which are controversial, mostly you are going to get procedures there. So things like payroll, bad debts, okay, because bad debts go with receivables, bad debt and receivables, purchases because of VAT and sales, then depreciation, amortization, and estimates, okay? That also goes with capital allowance, okay? So when you are doing a tax audit procedure, make sure that the tax audit procedure that you are doing also relates to the tax law. It makes them understand that, yes, this guy that is doing the procedure understands his laws. So check whether depreciation has been added back, right? And capital allowance granted instead in relation to or in accordance with the third schedule and section 14 of the Income Tax Act. And also recalculate the depreciation or recompute the capital allowance to see if it is computed in line with the law. So when you are doing tax audit procedures and you're able to quote the law, even if you don't know the section, don't worry, but just say in accordance with the relevant sections of the Income Tax Act, the examiner understands that you know what you are talking about. You get the idea? That is what we are looking at. So these are basically what you need to know under this stage. So if you know these things under the fieldwork stage, then I can say for sure you are ready for the tax audit paper, because this area constitutes 60% of your paper, whether you like it or not. And I told you that it is more practical than theory, but you need to know the theoretical areas under this area. Very important. So we are done with the fieldwork stage. Now the next stage, which is what the working paper documentation stage, is straightforward. That one is mostly theory, but how can it become practical? So the working paper documentation stage can become practical for you. That's the first stage. How does it become practical? So working paper documentation stage can become practical if you are told to fill up a working paper. They can give you a sample working paper and ask you to fill it up. That's the only thing that will make it practical. Or mostly they are just going to ask you components or the features that you see on a working paper, objectives or importance of working paper documentation. Okay, why should we do working paper documentation? Then the types of working paper, okay? Then custody of working paper, who keeps working papers, custody of working papers, then review of working papers, okay? So these are all theories. And then you can also look at yes, basically these are the things you have to look at. Okay, then standardization of working papers, that's the last thing. Standard of the working papers. Okay, so these are all theories that you have to look at. Then finally, the last and most important part of a tax audit is the reporting. Okay, the reporting stage, which should begin with what? The audit review. Now, under a tax audit comes with audit review. And the most important area, the reason why we are doing all this is to produce a tax audit report. And this tax audit review are of three forms. It could be an auditor self-review by the auditor. It could be a head of audit review, okay? And it can be an overall strategic review. Okay, so these are the areas that you have to look out for. Okay, then after audit review, remember that even the audit report that has been prepared by your external auditor needs to be reviewed to see why they've given you that opinion and whether we can trust your financial statement. So audit opinions, people think audit opinions does not relate to a tax audit, but trust me, it does. Because the opinion that your external auditors have given can also be used as a mandate for a final audit report, right? So audit opinions need to be known, and they are, whether it is what, a qualified opinion, which means there's something that qualifies it not to be trusted, or an unqualified opinion. An unqualified opinion means that there's nothing wrong. Your financial statements show a true and fair view. So audit review, audit opinions. Then we finally do an overall review, which includes all this. Then we send a draft report to the taxpayer. But before this draft report that we are going to send the taxpayer would have some proposed adjustments, okay? Some proposed adjustments that we as tax auditors would want to do. Then finally, we do an exit conference. Remember, we did an entry conference. Since we did an entry conference or initial interview, this is an exit interview. When you are coming, you do interview. When you are leaving, you do interview. Now, this exit conference, the same way you need to know the purpose, why we do it, or the objectives of the exit conference. You also need to know the importance of an exit conference and what goes on in the exit meeting. Very, very, very important. Then finally, you need to look at, actually, is the exit conference. Then finally, is in the exit conference that we discuss this proposed adjustment, and the taxpayer decides whether he agrees with this adjustment or not, or the assessment that was raised in the draft. Then finally, a final audit report will come, right? The final audit report will come, and this final audit report actually comes with your assessment, okay? And this is where you can finally object to the assessment. But between the exit conference and the final audit report, between the draft to the final, you can actually decide before it is finalized, because before your assessment is finalized, okay, so we have objection to assessments, okay? So this ends the tax audit itself. This ends the tax audit itself. But apart from these areas, there are other areas that need to be considered, okay, where I told you that you need to also look at what tax investigation, okay? That one is not audit, but investigation. So for tax investigation, or simply back duty, okay, where we pass behind your back to investigate you. So for tax investigations, there are some things that we need to know, especially we need to know the golden rule of every investigation has some golden rules that need to be followed, okay? So we use what we call tapas, okay? So we need to know the golden rules of investigation. We need to know what goes into a tax investigation itself, okay? So we need to also know things like fraud investigations, okay? We need to know compliance verifications, what goes into compliance verifications. Then after compliance verifications, we also need to know assurance engagement, okay? Also need to know assurance engagement, but before that, we need to know forensic investigations, and finally, assurance engagement. So for assurance engagement, so assurance and non-audit engagement, let me make it that way, and non-audit engagement. So what are assurance engagements? You need to know it, okay? Especially the 5 elements that go into every assurance engagement and the types of assurance engagement, the 2 main types of assurance engagement. Now, under non-audit engagement, most of the time, you can have prospective financial information, that is future information, which I think appeared in August 2022. So prospective financial statements or financial information. We have due diligence assignments, okay? Due diligence assignments, or maybe review engagements, okay? So these are the key areas that you actually have to look out for. Then other assignments. So other assignment can be anything from bank reconciliation review to cash flow review. Any sort of things tax auditors or actually take up can come in these areas. But these are the areas that you need to look out in a tax investigation, whether you like it or not. The name of the paper is what? Tax audit and what? Special investigations. Tax audit and special investigation. So that's the name of the paper. So whether you like it or not, you can't ignore special investigations. You can't ignore special investigations. So that is it. Okay, so these are the areas that you have to really look out for when it comes to tax investigation. Now, that brings us to the miscellaneous areas, right? The miscellaneous areas comes with the first part I have to do is the determination of your tax liability. Now, we have two main ways we determine your tax liability, which is the direct way and the indirect way. The direct way is through the normal tax audit process, which we went through, right? Which is the direct methods where we actually do determination or through, we determine your tax liability through assessments, right? Now we can use indirect methods to determine your tax liability. And indirect methods means we don't use the actual direct way through assessment where we compute your tax liability just like that. But here we use indirect methods usually through investigation and alertness or mind or professional skepticism, okay, to identify where you have